Hey everyone, welcome to part 2 of our What is Tier 0 webinar series. We're going to give everyone a couple more minutes to join. So if you want to go grab popcorn or coffee or something, you have just a couple more minutes to do that. The numbers are still going up, so we'll give it a couple more minutes. As we wait, I'm going to launch a little poll here to see which ones of you participated in the last session and which ones of you are new to the series. Okay, it seems like we have over 60% new participants that did not join us for the first part. So we'll do a quick recap to bring you up to speed before we begin going over new content. All right, I'm going to end this poll and let's get started. So, hey everyone, again, welcome to part 2 of our What is Tier 0 webinar series. I am Elad Shamir, and with me today are Jonas Knudsen and Alexander Schmidt. Before we begin, let's review a few housekeeping items. We will record, or we are recording today's webinar, and we will share it in our post-webinar email in the next few days. The recording will also be available on demand shortly after the webinar concludes. You will be able to access it with the same link that you used to join us today. If you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A function here on Zoom, and we will try to get to all of them by the end. On the agenda today, we will kick off with a very brief recap of the previous session for those who missed it, and to refresh the memory of those who were here with us. After that, we will continue the discussion and cover additional principles and object types such as OUs and containers, GPOs, special users, and read-only domain controllers. Who are we? We have Jonas representing the Bloodhound Enterprise team with vast experience mapping attack paths across identities and resources in on-prem AD and Azure. I am representing SpectraOps' research department with decades of experience abusing and defending access to Tier 0. And we have a special guest today, Alexander Schmidt from Thiel Consulting, with decades of experience defending access to Tier 0. Alex, would you like to introduce yourself in a bit more detail?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. Maybe just one sentence about me and Thiel. We're probably not as known as you guys are. So we are a consulting company based in Germany. We've been founded in 2017. I'm co-founder and co-CEO of the company, and we are specialized in helping our customers securing the Active Directory environment. That's enough for now. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. I'm sure it will be a great addition to the discussion later on. All right, so let's start with a recap. In the last session, we discussed the history of the tier 0 concept. Microsoft initially introduced this concept, if I'm not mistaken, in 2012 as part of the tiered administration model to mitigate privilege escalation attacks in Active Directory environments. This architecture, this model was incorporated into the enhanced security admin environment architecture, which is a bit mouthful. So people usually call it the Red Forest architecture. And it was later retired by Microsoft a couple of years ago and replaced with the enterprise access model, which added cloud components into the mix. The tiering model is still very much part of the enterprise access model, only that tiers are now planes, with tier 0 being the control plane. Most people are familiar with the term tier 0, so we will continue using that for this series, even though we will cover some cloud components later on in future sessions. Because Microsoft no longer maintains the definition for tier 0, we took the liberty of pulling apart their original definition, identifying flaws in it, and coming up with what is, in my very biased opinion, a better definition. So we ended up with tier 0 is a set of assets in control of enterprise identities and their security dependencies. We define control as a relationship that can contribute to compromising the controlled asset or impact its operability. And I say contribute to compromising rather than compromising because some attacks have several prerequisites or several moving parts. So a tier 0 asset may be a link in an elaborate attack chain. In the second part of the previous session, we reviewed Microsoft's original list of tier 0 objects in light of this definition and determined which ones indeed belonged to tier 0 and which ones didn't. And we will continue that discussion today. After the last session, community members started contributing to our efforts and suggested additional principles and objects that we should include in tier 0. You can see those suggestions and add your own on GitHub in the URL that you see on the screen here. Today, we will discuss most of these suggestions, leaving AAD and trusts for a future session. We actually intended initially to discuss trusts today as well, but when we did a dry run last week, we realized that we actually don't have enough time to cover trusts as well, so we'll keep it for next time. And with that, I'll pass it over to Jonas to lead the conversation as we delve into AD containers.
Thank you. Yeah, so 3 of the suggestions that were submitted was the domain root objects, OUs or organizational units, and the AdminSDHolder container. So 3 objects that are all like containers in some way or another. So let's start by looking at containers in general. And oh, here we go. I can control the slides. Yeah, so here's a screenshot of the first level of containers within an Active Directory environment. This is just an example environment, my lab environment called Dumpster Fire. And you can see that there's a couple of containers here. So containers works the way that they are logical containers of AD objects in Active Directory. And it's possible to have containers within containers. There is also an object class in AD called container, but it's actually not the only class that can be used as a container. It turns out that all objects can actually be a container in some way or another. But the most common ones that we usually work with is the container class and the organizational units, or OUs, and then the domain head object. And the reason why we find these objects interesting is that you can configure permissions on these objects. They're secureable AD objects as well. And these permissions here can be inherited down to the child objects. And that could be, for example, tier 0 objects like users, computers, and groups. So we're interested in how can permissions on these containers here be abused to compromise the assets within the containers. And the general case for all containers is that, yeah, you can configure a permission to be inherited down to the children, but it's also possible to block these permissions on the child item. You can block or disable inheritance such that permissions set on the parent object will not be inherited down on the objects within the container. This way can stop this attack of containers, but there are many different other attack vectors that are that you can abuse in order to compromise content of a container, depending on what type of container it is. But if you look at this general rule here, we can say that an AD container is tier 0 if it contains tier 0 objects that can be compromised by an attacker with control over the container. The problem with that definition is that it is sometimes complicated to figure out whether or not you can actually compromise these objects within the container. For example, there's also the attack vector of linking a GPO that could be configured to compromise computers or users. And in some cases, there's also like specific permissions for example, the domain head objects. You can configure some specific permissions that allow you to compromise the entire domain. So we suggest that you keep things very simple and say that an AD container is tier 0 if it contains tier 0 objects. That makes it much easier for you to decide whether or not an object should be protected, and only tier 0 principals should be allowed to have permissions on the object. We also recommend that you use the power of naming conventions to actually protect or make it clear if a container is tier 0 or not. You could, for example, call it T0 underscore and then the name of the container to make it very clear that this is a tier 0 container and only tier 0 users should be having control over this asset here. And this idea of using a naming convention for tier 0 assets should also be applied to other assets as well, such as users and groups and even GPOs.
Yeah, I'll make another point there if you don't mind. When we discussed it, while we're preparing for this webinar, there was one thing that kept confusing me, at least in the beginning. If a container contains a tier 0 object, it is tier 0, but not vice versa. If an object, a user account, is in a tier 0 container, does not mean that that object, that user account or whatnot, is also tier 0. So it works only in one direction.
Yeah, and that's a good thing to mention, because it can be a bit confusing. But the whole idea is that if you have permissions on the parent object, you may be able to compromise the children. And if there's just a single tier 0 account within the container, then there's a risk for this object to be compromised. And you can say that if the container is tier 0, then it's okay for tier 0 admins to have control over the non-tier 0 objects within the container. So that's not a security risk. But yeah, good point. Let's dive into some of the examples that were suggested. The first one was this the domain root object. So the top object you look at when you open the OU structure in Active Directory. And this object here, it contains basically all the principles of the Active Directory, everything within the default naming context of the domain. So because it contains basically everything, it of course also contains tier 0 objects, and therefore it's also tier 0 by our definition. That said, it is possible to block inheritance on the child items of this object, but for the domain specifically, it's possible to also set some other permissions. The domain head object, it contains the permissions for DC replication. So if you have full control over the domain root object, you can perform what's known as an DC sync attack. So you can replicate all the password hashes for all the principals in the environment, and thereby obtain tier 0 credentials and compromise the environment. So yeah, this object is definitely tier 0.
Another classic attack that involves DC syncing is getting the credentials for the KrbTGT account and then forging golden tickets, which is a classic.
Yeah, yeah. Good point. Yeah. The next one, AdminSDHolder. AdminSDHolder is a container that exists under another container called system. And this container here is kind of funky. It doesn't contain anything. So immediate thought would be that this is not important. That's not the case. It is used as a template for the security descriptor of some special protected principals in Active Directory. These protected principals, also known as protected accounts and groups, includes domain admins, enterprise admins, and yeah, some other very privileged groups in Active Directory. And the way it works is that the security descriptor of AdminSDHolder is replicated to these protected accounts by a process called sdprop, and it happens every hour by default. So if you have control over AdminSDHolder, that control will also be replicated to these highly privileged accounts in the environment. So yeah, if you have control over AdminSDHolder, you will also have control over tier 0. So even though that the object does not contain any tier 0 objects, it is definitely a tier 0 object.
Before you continue to the next object, there's a question here relating to the previous slide, actually. How would you use a container to perform DC sync? So maybe to clarify, the domain root is a unique container in that sense. You can abuse the domain root to grant yourself the required permissions for the DC sync attack, but you cannot do that on any other container.
Yeah, that's correct. And also to avoid any confusions, it is not possible to grant any permissions to a container. So you cannot say that all the users in this container should be able to add members to this specific group or something. That's not possible. So you can only configure inbound permissions on a container, but not outbound, so to say. Yeah. The domain controllers OU. So here we have an OU, and OUs are a bit different from containers in the sense that you can also link GPOs to OUs. You can also do that to the domain head object. You cannot do that to containers. But the domain controllers OU here, it contains all the domain controllers of this given domain. And yeah, these domain controllers here in the environment, they can be compromised if you have control over the domain controllers OU. You could, for example, link a malicious GPO to the container and thereby compromise the domain controllers. If you have the privilege to create a GPO, or if you can modify an existing GPO. You could also compromise the domain controllers by using a permission and set it to be inherit down to the domain controllers, because domain controllers and read-only domain controllers are not protected with disabled inheritance by default. So domain controllers OU is definitely also tier 0. Then we have a more interesting use case here. The users container. It's a default container that contains a lot of default AD groups and is the default locations for new users created in the environment. I would say that it's a mess usually because it contains so many groups, and they are very different in the way that they should be handled and what permissions should be granted on these groups here. So here's a screenshot from my lab environment. You can see that domain admins are, for example, in the users container by default, and also domain guests and domain users, something that's completely different, and it's definitely not tier 0. So we have all this mess in here, but we can definitely say that it does contain tier 0 objects because we have domain admins and also domain controllers group in here. What we discussed a lot before this session here is how can you actually compromise tier 0 by having privileges on the user's container. Many of these privilege groups are just domain admins and enterprise admins. They're protected with AdminSDHolder, so they have inheritance disabled. So even though you have full control over the user's container, you cannot compromise these groups. There are some of the groups in here that are highly privileged, but does not have inheritance disabled. And that includes DNS admins and cert publishers. DNS admins used to have a way to compromise the domain by a vulnerability on domain controllers, but that was passed by Microsoft, so that's no longer the case as far as I know. Cert publishers have some rights in the ADCS world and can do a lot of things, but we couldn't find anything that could be abused to compromise the environment. So to our knowledge, it's only possible to perform some harming actions against tier 0 by, for example, tampering with ADCS, but we couldn't find any way you could actually compromise the environment by having full control over the user's container. But if we fall back to our definition, we should definitely classify it as tier 0 because it does contain tier 0 assets. We do recommend, though, that in general that you have containers that are more dedicated to the tiers that you create in your environment. So your tier 0 assets go into an OU, for example, that's only for tier 0 assets, so it makes more easy for the admins to see what tier things belong to and dedicate the right permissions.
Yeah, at that point, I wanted to pick up a question that I answered already on the questions and answers, which was a bit different but related. But the solution is to create a tiered OU structure, basically to have all tier 0 objects and tier 1 objects in a respective container, secure that OU structure with very tight permissions, and then have solid processes around it to manage or to define how a tier 0 object is created and handled during the lifetime. Shameless plug, Jonas and I talked about that at Troopers this year, so if you're interested in more details, you can watch the recording.
There's another interesting question here. Would you recommend moving domain admins, domain controllers, and other similar groups to a different OU than users?
Yeah, that's a good question. We also had that discussion. Before I joined SpectreOps, I worked as a consultant helping implement tiering for companies. And I remember with one customer, I did move all the tier 0 groups out of the user's container to clean things up. And then Alex made me aware that there's actually a Microsoft article that says that some of these groups cannot be moved out of the user's container. Which is kind of interesting. I think it also says that it's not safe to move these groups out of the user's container.
There's actually one recommendation about DHCP administrators that it is supported but not recommended without any more explanation. So I would take that article with a grain of salt, basically. But our recommendation is, yes, move everything out of the user container to respective other containers, but try it out first in a test environment, especially if you use the group. Another recommendation is that you don't use many of the groups at all, like account operator or server operator and stuff like that. The recommendation is to don't use them at all, create custom groups and delegate exactly the permissions you need. So if you follow that practice, a lot of the groups can be moved because they are empty anyway, and the ones you use and legitimately need to use, test it out if you can move them without any impact to your environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would speculate that Microsoft is just concerned that they might have hard-coded the paths to these groups somewhere in the code base, but they're not just quite sure whether they did that or not. So they recommend not to move them.
Yeah, but it's actually interesting because the groups that you have in the built-in container can actually not be moved out of the built-in container. So that's actually, yeah, a limitation that you cannot bypass. But it seems like you can move everything in the user's container. Yeah. But yeah, let's move on to the next topic. And that is group policy objects, GPOs. That was also suggested. And GPOs can definitely also be a tier 0 asset. We came up with this definition at first. So like a GPO is tier 0 if it's linked to a container, and a GPO can be linked to the domain, to OUs, and also sites. And if any of these containers contain one or more tier 0 users or computers not protected with GPO inheritance, then it is a tier 0 GPO. So the reason why to classify a GPO as tier 0 is that if you have permissions on a GPO linked to tier 0 assets, then you can compromise the object in some special ways. There's actually a lot of different ways you can compromise objects. It's only users or computers that are hit by these GPO settings. But for a computer, you could, for example, add yourself to the local administrators group on the computer. And for a user, you can specify that every time the user log in somewhere, that a script will start, and that script could be, for example, a reverse shell that allows you to compromise the user. This definition here is, again, a bit tricky because it also involves this not statement. So it should not be classified as tier 0 if these tier 0 users and computers are protected with GPO inheritance. So it's possible on GPOs to say that you don't want any GPO settings that apply to the above parent objects. In general, disabling GPO inheritance is it makes it very difficult to predict what's going to happen in the environment, and it creates a messy environment. So we'll definitely not recommend to do that. And also it's possible to enforce a GPO, so you can actually enforce it such that this inheritance does not apply. So let's keep things very simple. And I think I've messed up this slide here, but there we go. That was okay. Interesting. Let's keep it simple and say that GPO is a tier 0 asset if it is linked to a tier 0 object or a tier 0 container. That makes it much easier. And again, you can name the GPO something with tier 0 to make it easy to see that this GPO is tier 0, and only tier 0 principals should be allowed to edit this GPO. Yeah, any comments for GPOs before we move on? No?
I think it's very clear.
Yeah.
You do have another point to make there around the naming conventions, just like with OUs, can apply the same principle here.
Yeah, and it can be I think like we talk about it, like a challenge can sometimes be that what we see in real environments is that maybe support admin creates a GPO called enable Windows Defender, apply them to all the workstations in the environment, and then the tier 0 admin, he sees that GPO and thinks that that's a great GPO, I'll link it to all the domain controllers, for example. But now the support admin, he has control over this GPO still, and that GPO now applies to tier 0. So the right thing to do in this scenario here is to create 2 separate GPOs, one for the tier 2 or whatever the laptops belongs to, and one for tier 0. If the support admin still needs edit rights on the GPO.
Yeah, I think around GPOs in day-to-day life, there's a very high chance that you make mistakes if you don't have a clear structure, OU structure, and your objects classified, and have a good naming convention in your GPOs, and have a good process how you create, manage, and take live GPOs. So I think the recommendation is even more worse than the one on the OUs, probably.
Yeah.
Maybe one comment to the audience. So feel free to use the chat if you have different opinions. We want to make that interactive, like we did the last time. So if there is a discussion or you disagree with what we say, feel free to say so, and then we will take it up.
There is a question here. Would you advocate the use of filtering to apply or remove GPOs from applying to tier 0?
No, because there are 2 kind of filterings for GPOs. There are the security filtering, where you can specify what assets should actually be hit by this GPO. By default, it's configured to authenticated users, so it will hit anything. And then you can also use VMI filtering. So for example, you can use a VMI filter to say that this GPO should only apply to computers with the operating system * Windows * something, to make sure that, yeah, it will only have hit certain Windows versions, for example. The problem is that these configurations are set on the GPO itself. So if you have control over the GPO, you can just remove those or edit those to include the target that you want to hit. Yeah, so I would not recommend using filtering to filter out tier 0 assets. But it's a good question.
And basically, there can be a performance impact if you use a lot of WMI filters, and depending how you write them. So in general, I would recommend not to use WMI filters if you can avoid it.
Yeah, and it also adds more complexity. Yeah.
You need to look very closely, because it's on the bottom of the screen, basically just one drop down. So in day-to-day operations, it's likely to make a mistake here, remove it, or click the wrong filter or whatever. So our recommendation would be OU structure.
Yeah. So I'll add something to your point, Alex, regarding performance impact. Mm-hmm. A lot of you, I'm sure, have experienced at one point or another that every time you boot your laptop, it takes like 5 minutes to load. You know, you're stuck on the login screen. In many cases, it is because you have a lot of different GPOs with WMI filters running there. It's not always the case, but it's a prime suspect for sure.
Yeah. All right. Let's move on to the next topic, and that's a couple of special users that were also suggested. And the first one is the built-in administrator account. So in every Windows deployment that exists, this built-in administrator. It has this RID 500, so that's the way you can identify it. Some people choose to rename it, but you can always find the RID 500. And Active Directory has this built-in administrator as well. So the administrator is the administrator of all the domain controllers in the given domain. And it has admin rights to these domain controllers through the administrators group. So they have full control over domain controllers. So with full control over domain controllers, you can compromise tier 0 definitely, and that's why this user here should also be classified as tier 0.
I think this one is sort of a no-brainer. There's not gonna be any argument whether this one is a tier 0 object or not.
Yeah, I guess the only counter argument would be that some choose to disable this account, but still, you should probably still protect it as a tier 0 user. Yeah. The next one is also special, KrbTGT. So when you log into your Windows computer and Kerberos authentication is used, you will receive this kind of session ticket for authenticating in the environment called a ticket granting ticket. And this ticket here includes information about what access you should have in the environment. So it will include the SID for your user and all the groups that you are a member of. Active Directory will encrypt this ticket with the password material of a special account in Active Directory, and that is this account here, KrbTGT. So if you obtain the credentials of this account here, then it is possible to compromise the environment. Because as Elad already mentioned, you can create this what's called a golden ticket. You can create your own ticket granting ticket and put in, for example, domain admins in there and encrypt it with the password material of this account here. And then Active Directory will believe it's valid. And yeah, you can impersonate anyone basically. So it's definitely possible to compromise the environment if you obtain the credentials of this account. That said, we had a lot of discussion about this account as well, because as far as we know, there's no publicly abuse technique right now to abuse full control granted on this account to actually obtain the credentials of the user or compromise the domain in any other ways. The immediate thought would of course be just to reset the password of this user. But what happens is that Active Directory will use a random string rather than the password that you specify when you reset the password of this specific account. So it will not know the password if you reset the password of this user here.
Yeah. There used to be a way to do that, actually. About 4 years ago, I published a post called Wagging the Dog, and in that I delved into Kerberos delegation. And you used to be able to abuse Kerberos delegation on this account to actually obtain a TGT for whoever you liked. But back in 2021, if you remember the no-pack attack, Microsoft addressed something else and unintentionally mitigated that attack as well. So we used to be able to do that. We can't do that anymore. But even though you can't compromise whatever you like, you can definitely cause a disruption if you have full control of this account. For example, you can reset the password a couple of times before the domain controllers get to replicate the change. And that will definitely cause some mayhem in your environment. So even though it's not a compromise, it can affect the operability of the environment.
Yeah, there's another one, basically. The domain controllers accept the current password and the last password. So if you change the password twice within the time frame of the ticket lifetime, it invalidates all Kerberos tickets. So all your systems will need to re-authenticate, which basically breaks everything. This can really wreak havoc, so to say. But on the other hand, it's a very good practice to change the password on a regular basis, because if an attacker has the password material, he can create golden tickets, which are quite hard to detect. So there should be a process to do that every 6 months or something.
There is a question here. Did I say that golden ticket attacks won't work anymore since 2021? So no, that's not what I'm saying. There was another attack against this account, basically configuring Kerbos delegation on it, and then using that as an alternative to golden tickets to obtain TGTs for whoever you like. Golden tickets are definitely still a thing. However, ever since this patch in 2021, if I'm not mistaken, Mimikatz no longer produces valid golden tickets due to a certain change that Microsoft introduced to the pack structure. But if you use another tool, such as Rubius, you can still forge golden tickets as good as always.
Yeah.
All right. So read-only domain controllers. I'll take over this topic. I've done a bit of research on that earlier this year, so it's close to my heart. I don't think we really need to explain why domain controllers in general are so sensitive and must be protected accordingly. And that means physical security as well. But what should organizations do if on the one hand, they require directory services in some physical location, while on the other hand, they can't provide adequate physical security to a domain controller in that location? This scenario is not common nowadays, but it used to be an issue in remote physical locations with unreliable network links, such as remote branch offices or retail stores. And we still see that nowadays on mine sites and even on ships out in the ocean. To solve that problem, Microsoft introduced the read-only domain controller, or RODC for short. The RODC doesn't have write access to the directory, so it can't make any changes to any objects there, unlike a normal domain controller or a writable domain controller. The RODC has only a filtered copy of the directory, meaning that sensitive information or sensitive attributes are not replicated to it. There is an exception to that, and that exception is some passwords. So some user and service account credentials can be replicated to the RODC to support authentication. The idea is that every RODC should have its own password replication policy, allowing the credentials for accounts that operate in the same physical location to be retrieved. Now, there are two lists that control the RODC password replication list. There's an allow list and a deny list. The deny list prevents the credentials of specific accounts from being replicated. And conversely, the allow list permits password replication to the RODC. Now, what would happen if an account is on both lists? Luckily, Microsoft made the right decision there, and the deny list would take precedence in that case. Now, those lists are stored in the MSDS never reveal group attribute and the MSDS reveal on demand group attribute of the RODC computer object in Active Directory. The allow list should include only accounts that operate in the same physical location, and the deny list should include all tier 0 principals for good measure. Now, I want to make it clear that no tier 0 account should be used in an untrustworthy physical location. So no tier 0 account should be added to the allow list of any RODC if you do things right. Now, let's make it very clear before we continue the discussion. The RODC can access the credentials of all accounts present in the allow list, while also not present in the deny list. So if an account is in the allow list but not in the deny list, the RODC can compromise it. There's a question here. Does this mean RODCs cannot be used in relay attacks due to their no write access? Yes. So when you do relay attacks to LDAP, what you usually do is modify something. And because RODCs don't have write access, they're not good NTLM relay targets. Okay, so there are quite a few components involved in RODC's operations. We have the RODC host itself. There's the RODC computer object in Active Directory. Every RODC has its own KrbTGT object or account that allows the RODC to issue TGTs that work only with that specific RODC. Now, I want to note here that there is a way to upgrade a TGT issued by an RODC to a full TGT issued by a writable domain controller. However, this exchange is possible only for users whose passwords are allowed to be replicated to the RODC. Otherwise, it's denied. So this upgrade is subject to the RODC's password replication policy. And we also have here a few related Active Directory groups that we will explain in a moment. Now, before we delve into each one of those components, I'm going to kick off another poll here and ask everyone which ones of these components that you see on the screen now belong in tier 0. So I'll give it a minute for everyone to answer, and it will be interesting to see your opinions before we continue the discussion. Answers are coming in. That's good. We'll give it a bit more time for more people to give us their opinions.
I think that you're gonna disagree with a lot of people in a minute.
That's fine. That's what we're here for. We're here to argue. Okay. I don't see any more coming in, so I'll end the poll now. You know what? I'll leave it open as I continue speaking. If anyone's still working on it, feel free to submit. All right, so let's start with the RODC computer object. The password replication policy of the RODC is stored in the attributes of this object. So if you can control this object, you can modify these attributes, change the password replication policy to allow the replication of a domain admin, and compromise the domain. So there is a path to tier 0 compromise if you control the RODC computer object. 62% of the responses to the poll agree with, say that it belongs in tier 0, and I agree. There is a tier 0 compromise path here. This is where you control the password replication policy. It definitely belongs in tier 0. What about the RODC host? The RODC host cannot change its password replication policy. If someone made the mistake of allowing the replication of a tier 0 account password to the RODC, that would unfortunately allow whoever compromises the RODC, the host itself, to compromise the domain. And we've seen that in the field. We've done that on red team engagements. However, there is no inherent path from an RODC host to a tier 0 compromise. So in my opinion, it can stay out of tier 0 as intended by Microsoft. 40% of the responses here disagree with me and say that it should be part of tier 0, but I think 60%, the majority is with me. So far we have quorum, that's good. I want to note here that there is a difference between how we classify the RODC host and how we classify the RODC computer object. And that is very unique to RODCs in Active Directory. I can't think of any other similar case in Active Directory where we classify the object and the host itself or the real world entity differently. Okay, next we have the read-only domain controllers group in Active Directory. This is an Active Directory group that contains all the RODCs in the environment. This group doesn't grant its members any special access. We discussed it in a previous session, so I don't want to elaborate on it too much. But the bottom line here is that it does not allow compromising tier 0, and it is not part of tier 0. And again, we have 40% here disagreeing with me, 60% agreeing. So we still have quorum, but we're going to have some disagreements soon. All right, next to the allow RODC password replication group. So this is a default group for principals that can have their credentials retrieved by RODCs. If you provision a new RODC and just click next, 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 then you will ultimately find that group in the RODC's allow list. However, this group has no inherent functionality beyond being added to the allow list by default. The RODC password replication policy is stored in the RODC's computer object attributes. And ultimately, that is what determines whether an account can have its password retrieved by the RODC or not. As I mentioned earlier, every RODC should have its own allow list that contains only accounts that operate in the same physical location. So having a domain-wide allow list doesn't actually make any sense. So I'd argue that this group should actually not be used at all. And the bottom line is that the description of this group is misleading and it doesn't belong in tier 0. And this time we have disagreement with the audience here. 60% of you think that it does belong in tier 0. So if you want to have a go at it, feel free to send something in the chat or in the Q&A, and I'm happy to debate that. Fight me. The next object is, okay, let's see. If you can, there's a question here. If you control both allowed RODC password replication group and denied RODC password replication group, can't you then control a tier 0 account? So I'll explain what the denied RODC password replication group is to everyone, and then I'll answer that question. So this group is very similar to the previous one, only the opposite. If you provision a new RODC and just click next, 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 then you'll find that that group is in the RODC's denial list. However, unlike the previous group, having a domain-wide denial list does make sense. That list should include all of your tier 0 principals and maybe some other sensitive accounts as well. Does it mean that this group belongs in tier 0? I would say No, because again, it has no inherent functionality beyond being added to the denial list by default. And ultimately, the RODC's password replication policy is what matters. So I argue that both the allowed RODC password replication group and the denied RODC password replication group both don't belong in tier 0. Now, it is true, to answer the question here, if someone just click next, 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 and they have those groups in the allow list and the deny list of an RODC, and you control both groups, then you will be able to potentially compromise tier 0. But I would say that this is a misconfiguration. It's not inherent to what those groups do, to what access those groups have. It's just an artifact of someone clicking next, next, next without any planning.
And I guess it also requires that you have admin access to the root, to the read-only domain controller hosts as well, so you can compromise, the host and from there actually retrieve the credentials. So yeah, you need all these things, and you need the object to be misconfigured in some way, if you will say.
But then the next question from the attacker's point of view or pen tester's point of view would then be, how many environments have you seen where exactly this happened, that someone just clicked next, 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 and you can actually find something valuable here?
So in my experience, yes, it does happen that people click next, 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 and then you find both of these groups in the allow list and the deny lists. But I wouldn't say that just because the defaults are insecure, it changes the tier 0 definition. We should look at the inherent functionality of these objects and what are they actually capable of doing. And in that case,
I perfectly agree.
Yeah.
But
right.
Still, from an attacker's point of view, you don't care if someone classified something as tier 0. If you can abuse it, you can abuse it, right?
Yeah, but on the same token, if someone made the mistake of granting all authenticated users generic all on the administrator account, that's also, something that as an attacker, I don't care if it's supposed to or not. It's supposed to happen or not, but I'll abuse it.
Generic all on the domain head, so everything happens.
I think
Absolutely.
we also discussed whether or not this group could be considered tier 0, and then you could use that to protect all the tier 0 principles. But it also creates a weird dynamics when you have this group containing tier 0 members, but potentially also containing non-tier 0 members, because you might have other assets, for example, tier 1 service accounts that also never should be retrieved from read-only domain controllers. So it makes it complex and confusing. So it's probably better to create a dedicated tier 0 group and set that in the deny list instead of using this group.
Yeah, I agree. All right, let's carry on to the next. By the way, in terms of the denied RODC password replication group, the poll results are that 37% of the participants think that this one belongs in tier 0. So even less than the allowed list. For some reason, a lot of people thought that the allowed list does belong in tier 0, but the denied list is not. Okay. Next one is the enterprise read-only domain controllers group. This group contains all the RODCs in the forest. It grants its members the get changes permission on the domain. Now, some people mistakenly think that having the get changes permission allows performing the dissect attack, but that's not true. The secret ingredient for dissecting is actually the get changes all permission, which this group does not have. and therefore it actually doesn't allow compromise in tier 0, and therefore it also does not belong in tier 0. 43% of the participants here thought that this group belongs in tier 0. So 57% agree with us here. So that's good. And the last, but definitely not least, is the RODC's KrbTGT account. This account is what the RODC uses to encrypt and sign TGTs that it issues. As I mentioned, there is a mechanism that allows exchanging those RODC TGTs for full TGTs, but it is subject to the RODC's password replication policy. Therefore, the RODC's dedicated KrbTGT account does not have an inherent path to compromising tier 0, and it does not belong in tier 0. It is subject to the password replication policy controlled by the attributes of the RODC computer object. I'll also note that the RODC host has control of the RODC KrbTGT account. So if we decided that the RODC KrbTGT account should be in tier 0, then we would have to move the RODC host back into tier 0 as well because of control. Control is transitive. If this account is in tier 0, it would mean that whoever can access that, whoever can control it, should also be in tier 0. And if that was the case, it would also mean that RODCs cannot be deployed in untrustworthy locations, which defeats the purpose of having RODCs to begin with. So it does align with Microsoft's intention when introducing RODCs. And we actually have more disagreement on this one than all the others that we discussed so far. 71% of the participants think that this account does belong in tier 0. So that's interesting. Again, if anyone wants to fight me, go ahead and send a message in the chat or in the Q&A function here, and I'm happy to discuss that.
There's actually an interesting question regarding replication of the GPOs master keys. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but I assume that a read-only domain controller will not retrieve the GPOs master keys. Do you guys know that?
I've never actually tested it, but I believe it wouldn't be replicated. But yeah. I can't tell you that. Can't tell you that for sure. But an interesting discussion is: does that key belong in tier 0? That's an interesting question. Maybe we should add it as a topic for the next session. I think that's a very interesting one.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So all the information we discussed today and in the previous session is available in the tier 0 table repository on GitHub. You are all welcome to contribute. If you make an interesting contribution, we might discuss it in the next session, and maybe we'll also invite you to join us for the discussion. So you might be a guest speaker. So please go ahead and whatever thoughts you have, feel free to share them there. Topics for the next sessions. So some of the topics we plan to cover in the next sessions include roles and components in and off Azure AD, or Entra ID, as Microsoft calls it now. We may also discuss some other Microsoft identity-related components, such as ADFS, ADCS, and SCCM. Third-party solutions, such as PAM solutions, EDRs, backup solutions, and other topics that community members might suggest. So please don't hesitate to, again, contribute to the tier 0 table repository, and we will try to pick up those contributions and discuss them in the next session. Questions. If anyone has any questions that we haven't addressed yet, we're happy to hang around a bit longer and answer them. So far, we did answer all the questions that you guys had either live or in writing. But we'll hang around a few more minutes to see if anyone has any other questions that they want to share with us. Does anyone disagree with any of our classifications or arguments and want to discuss them?
I think one of the community members also mentioned that read-only domain controller could be misconfigured to, for example, contain the what's called DSRM recovery password, or the same password as regular domain controllers, and that is a somewhat common misconfiguration. But I think that doesn't justify read-only domain controllers to be tier 0. It's just another example of password reuse that shouldn't exist. Another thing that I've also seen is that you can configure. There's these attributes that read-only domain controllers will not retrieve from Active Directory. That includes, for example, the lapse password. But there's several guides online on how you can modify this filtered attribute set so that the lapse password will be retrieved by read-only domain controllers. If you have lapse deployed to a tier 0 computer, then that will also allow you to compromise tier 0 through the read-only domain controller. So there's definitely possibilities for making these configurations for read-only domain controllers, but yeah, as Elad said, the intention is that it's not supposed to be tier 0. So if you add it to tier 0, you might as well just have regular domain controllers and avoid the trouble.
Yeah, maybe, and it's an interesting point to discuss. Does this configuration belong in tier 0?
Oof, yeah, that's yeah. I think the configuration for the filtered attribute set is specified in the schema, and I believe we classified schema admins as being tier 0. So yeah, I guess it's down that alley.
Yeah. We have a question here. Do you have a resource on virtual or sensible privileged access workstations that you can recommend?
That's Alex, you have something, don't you?
Not really a resource, and I'm not entirely sure if I understand the question, but what I read out of it is basically, or what we see a common customer requirement is to, especially in tier 1 and tier 2, is to save on hardware and not burden the administrators with handling multiple physical devices. So the question is quite common that the customers ask, okay, can we host a privileged access workstation on a virtualization system? And the answer would be, yes, you can, but then the virtualization system needs to be tier 0 as well. And the physical device you use to access this virtual system needs to be tier 0 as well, because you want to prevent keyloggers and all the stuff you do your office work on to interfere with the credentials to that tier 0 device. So in reality, it's not a viable option in my point of view. What is viable is that you have a physical tier 0 PAW and you connect to your office system running as a virtual desktop somewhere. This we have seen, and this is, from a tiering point of view, okay.
I think that relates to the clean source principle. You need to start your journey into tier 0 from a trusted clean source, And it's very common to see people doing the other way around, like they start from a less trustworthy workstation and then they sort of step up and log into a PAM solution or some POW, virtual POW, and that's exactly the opposite of what you should be doing.
The discussion gets interesting when you throw PAM in the mix. Basically, can a PAM system help you secure the credentials even if you work from an untrusted device? So we will discuss that on a future webinar.
Yeah, no, I guess I'll throw in a little spoiler. When I was red teaming, I definitely saw those setups and I've abused them. It's definitely doable. So I wouldn't trust that, but we'll elaborate on that on a future session.
Yeah, I think that is a very interesting discussion, and it's not easily answered probably because it depends on what PAM system and what capabilities does it have, but it's a very, I think, worthy discussion to have because it's a very common customer demand, so to say.
There is one more question here. Would you see your virtualization system as tier 0 if hosting domain controllers? Would you split virtualization infra in tier 0 and tier 1? So we partially touched that, I think, on the previous session. I think we mentioned there that, yes, virtualization, hypervisors, if you're running domain controllers on them, then yes, you should consider them tier 0. Would you split virtualization infra into tier 0 and tier 1? Alex, Jonas, do you have any thoughts here?
I do. And it's the classic answer, it depends. We have that discussion with basically every customer we introduce tiering, because at some point, or nowadays, everyone is running domain controller virtualized. And depending on the customer size, usually you have a dedicated team running the virtualization infrastructure because you have a multitude of virtualization hosts which need to be maintained and operated. And there is a requirement that you keep the amount of tier 0 administrators as low as possible, which contradicts basically to have all these virtualization admins as tier 0 admins just because the domain controller runs on it. So it depends how the customer wants to split the teams and the operational responsibilities in the end. Both are viable. You can have your complete virtualization infrastructure in tier 0 and operate it as tier 0, or you split the infrastructure and have the tier 0 team operate a smaller virtualization cluster running the tier 0 systems and separate it from tier 1 virtualization infrastructure. We've both seen, and both works if you do it right.
Thank you. One last question that Andrea asked: cert publishers, tier 0 or not? So that's a great question. I'll definitely leave that for a future session because I am not quite sure yet. So we've done some preliminary research into that. Andrea actually did some research into that himself as well. And we haven't found a path to compromise in tier 0 by controlling that group yet. Doesn't mean that it's not there, but we just haven't found it yet. I will note that when you deploy Cloud KrbOS Trust as your AAD to on-prem AD integration model, that model actually uses RODCs as well. And then Microsoft does create sort of a default denial list there. And Microsoft does include the cert publishers group in that denial list in that scenario. So for some reason, Microsoft is convinced that this group should be considered tier 0. But we still need to figure out why and whether we agree or disagree. So we'll keep that for maybe next time.
It's it actually also used to be protected by AdminSDHolder. Back in server 2003, it was, but for some reason it was removed. Yeah, I have no clue why. I looked it up in my lab environment and found that, yeah, first of all, it contains all the CA servers, and then it has generic all on all the root CA objects. It has generic all on the AIA container within the PKI structure, and also the CDP container. I'm not entirely sure on how you can abuse that, but it's definitely some juicy permissions. Then also it has write access on the user certificate attribute of all users, computers, and managed service accounts. So that's definitely something very interesting about this group. And I guess you can break some functionality of ADCS with this group. So that's also why we definitely want to classify it as TS0, because you can disrupt operations of TS0, but how you can abuse it to take over the control of TS0 is definitely an interesting question that we don't have the answer for yet.
So maybe we'll delve into that in more detail after doing some more research into it in the next session. All right, we'll wrap it up here. Thank you everyone for joining us today. As we mentioned earlier, the recording will be available for you on demand later on. After we finish that, you can finish this session. You can use the same link used to join us to gain access to it, and we will also send out an email with the link in the next few days. Thanks everyone, and see you next time.
Bye-bye.